Guys, Jorel from Hyper Coliseum today to bring you another information style video like the webcam guide I did last year. Whether you're someone that's been playing for a while, someone that's new to Digimon but familiar with other TCGs, or just starting out with Digimon in general, there's some things about the game that people can get wrong or have the wrong idea about some of the effects. For those that don't know, I am an official level 1 judge for Digimon, and the idea for this video initially came from the band that organized Play Discord talking about common TCG terms, being used to describe things in Digimon that don't really equate one-to-one, and it eventually led to me writing down a bunch of bullet points about common misconceptions about the card game that eventually led into rulings that a lot of people repeatedly ask about, and eventually led into just how effects work in general. So I've divided the video into those three categories: misconceptions, effects, and rulings. Some things are going to tie hand in hand to others, but hopefully this video helps you a little bit in learning more about the card game and how it works. This could potentially be a decently long video, and it's probably going to feel like I'm jumping around a lot here and there, but we'll see where it goes. So let's get into it. The first thing I want to go over is the misconceptions of Digimon. These first couple of points apply mainly to the people that have had experience in other TCGs and are currently playing Digimon. To kick it off, let's start with what the whole video idea started with, and that's missing timing. Missing timing is a common term primarily used in Yu-Gi-Oh! That describes not being able to activate a card or an effect when it would meet its activation timing, because it's not possible in the current game state to activate it in response to the event that triggered it. As such, some may think it's possible to miss timing in Digimon when multiple effects happen at once, but this really isn't the case. The way effects work in Digimon is that effects are triggered at a certain point and then activated at another point. Mandatory effects must happen. If these are missed, depending on the situation, either the game state needs to be repaired so that the effect can be activated, or one or both players may receive a game warning for failure to maintain game state. For optional effects, these can be treated as the player opting not to activate the effect. Moving on, there's a few other common TCG terms used in Digimon that actually don't really exist in the game at all. One of them is summoning sickness. Now, summoning sickness is a term from Magic the Gathering that describes a creature that was played during the current turn not being able to attack or use their activated abilities. While yes, it's true that Digimon played during the current term are unable to attack unless they have Rush or been DNA Digivolved, they can actually activate their main abilities if they have one. A couple examples of this are ADR01 Jerry suspending to search the top 5 cards of your deck, or using promo Grand Kuwagamon's Digiburst effect to give one of your Digimon security attack +1. A couple of people in the Bandai server have taken the call on Digimon's version of Summoning Sickness as buffering, but we'll see if that catches on. The other terms that go hand in hand are proc and fizzle relating to effects. Proc, and I legitimately had to look this up, is a general gaming term that's actually an acronym standing for Programmed Random Occurrence, but it really just means whenever something triggers that has an effect. This isn't how effects truly work in Digimon though. Effects in Digimon, like I said earlier, first trigger and then activate. They don't simultaneously trigger and activate. If this doesn't make sense, don't worry, I'll cover it later in the effects section. Fizzle is another term from Magic, meaning a spell or ability failing to resolve as the target becomes missing or illegal when the spell or ability resolves. Effects in Digimon don't really fizzle or fail to resolve, but they can fail to activate. The only time effects fail to activate in Digimon is when the source of the activated effect is no longer in the area that it was triggered in. An example of this is any card with on deletion leaving the trash before the effect can activate, such as you grabbing the card with the effect back with Calling from the Darkness. Another misconception that was brought up is playing versus using, and on the same note, cost versus play cost. The game has very specific uses on the words playing and using. Digimon cards and Tamer cards are played, while option cards are used. If you look at what the memory cost is on a card, it actually states play cost on Digimon and Tamers and just cost on options. This is why things like BT14 BlackWarGreymon can play out stuff like Command-Dramon and Satsuki, but it can't use DCD Bomb with its end of your turn effect. To go further on using option cards, the rulebook states that when you use an option card, you place it in the battle area. This is worded incorrectly. When option cards are used, they are revealed from hand and put on the table. The most popular example of people mixing this up was using Seiken Meppa in the Royal Knights deck. Because of the wording in the rulebook, people thought you could gain memory with Yggdrasil's Inheritable when you use Seiken Meppa. This is incorrect because it actually isn't placed in the battle area, unlike Royal Knights of the Purge or from Master of the Disciple that directly state you to place the card in the battle area. Moving on, the next thing is paying costs without actually having a valid target on board. A lot of people ask about this, and yes, you can actually pay the cost to activate an effect even though there are no targets for that effect on board. An example of this is using Deathclaw to delete one of your Digimon, even if your opponent has nothing on board, to take advantage of any on-deletion effects that your Digimon might have. Lastly, I want to talk about overflow. This has been a hot topic of debate in the community, especially with the new Omnimon Ace from BT17. So Overflow reads, as this card moves from the battle area or under a card to another area, lose X amount of memory. What this actually means is that if the card moves from either A, the battle area, or B, from underneath a card to anywhere else other than those two spots, then Overflow will process. With Omnimon Ace and Yggdrasil, people are saying that because it's moving from the battle area to the breeding area, Overflow would process, but that isn't the case, since even though it's leaving the battle area, it's still going to underneath a card, Yggdrasil. The game is getting a rules update in Japan that just refers to the battle area and breeding area collectively as just the area to simplify Overflow. We don't know when we're going to get this in the English version, but as of right now, Japan does have this. Also, you may have noticed that I stated that Overflow processes and not Overflow triggers. That's because Overflow isn't an effect, it's a game mechanic, so trigger is an incorrect statement when regarding Overflow. Speaking of triggering, fuck you, Melga. Speaking of triggering, it's time to move on to the effects section. To start this off, let's talk about the types of effects in Digimon that you can commonly find, as well as the basics on how they work. There's passive or global effects such as Rapidmon X antibodies all turns, or any of the floodgates such as BT5 Gaussmon or BT8 Kakuyamon. Interruptive effects such as BT14 Gomamon or anything with Armor Purge. These are cards that state when condition would happen. And lastly, effects that trigger from events like Digimon Emperor or BT2 All Force Vidramon. These are cards that state when condition happens. And then there's effects that can affect Digimon like BT13 Alphamon or Congo, and ones that affect your opponent in particular like Crimson Blaze or BT8 Shivamon. Now, as I mentioned earlier, effects don't trigger and activate simultaneously. When effects trigger, there's checks that need to happen before the effect can activate. If conditions, is it the only effect that triggered, have multiple effects triggered, is it the most recent trigger, etc, etc. If the effect is the only one that triggered, for the most part, you're clear to move on to activating the effect. If more than one of your effects are triggered at the same time, you pick one to activate first. If that causes something else to trigger, you must activate the most recently triggered effect before going back to any initially triggered effects. An example of this is BT12 Takuya getting deleted with BT7 Flamemon in sources. If you don't have a Takuya in hand, you can activate a Gunimon first to play something like BT4 Flamemon. Since BT4 Flamemon was played, its on-play triggers and activates since it's the most recent trigger. Once the on-player finishes resolving, and you picked up a Takuya from that, you can go back to activating BT7 Flamemons on deletion to play that Takuya. If yours and your opponent's effects trigger at the same time, the active turn player's effects will take priority and activate first. Let's say the turn player has ST12 Jesmon on field and the opponent has BT16 EmperorGreymon Dragon mode on field. The Jesmon attacks and plays BT10 Sistermon CL with the when attacking effect. CL's on play and Dragon mode's all turns will trigger at the same time, but since the Jesmon player is the active player, CL's on play will activate first, allowing Jesmon to digivolve into Jesmon X Antibody or Jesmon GX. For if conditions, the effect only activates if the condition is met. For example, if you attack with something that is BT17 Labramon in sources, but the Digimon doesn't have jamming, the effect doesn't activate and you do not gain the memory. Let's say later in the turn you evolve into something that does have jamming and for whatever reason you're able to attack again, the effect successfully activates and you do gain the memory. We'll talk about the once per turn clause in a bit. Once an effect triggers, it cannot untrigger. A common example of this is X Antibody Protoform's effect with a protection effect like BT9Greymon X Antibody's effect. If your Digimon would get deleted, you can use Greymon's effect to prevent the deletion, but Protoform's effect has triggered and is mandatory, so you must activate and resolve Protoform's effect. Effects can also re-trigger. If an effect triggers, but is still pending activation because of other effects activating first and meets its trigger again, it can re-trigger and become the most recent trigger. An example of this is Biting Crush. If it triggers because the other player played a Digimon by an effect, but the Digimon has an on-play effect, the on-play triggers and activates first because it's the most recent trigger. But let's say that on-play effect plays another Digimon by an effect, then Biting Crush re-triggers and now becomes the most recent trigger. To go back to the once per turn clause like the Labramon example from earlier, once per turn effects are only used up when the effect successfully activates. The key word here is successfully. If you had EX5 Octomon in sources of one of your Digimon and your opponent plays a Digimon by effect, but they also have a memory floodgate on board, the effect does activate and uses up the once per turn successfully even though you don't gain the memory. For another example, let's look at having two Angelomon Aces on board when you have 4 security. Your opponent swings, checks security, and both of the Aces all turns will trigger. One of them will activate successfully and recover 1, putting you back at 4 security. The other sees that you're at 4 security and therefore does not fulfill the if condition of having 3 or less security, so the second Angelwoman's effect isn't activated and can actually be triggered and activated again later in the turn. Now that we've covered the basics of effects, I'm going to rapid fire some different topics that people wanted me to clarify while I was gathering the ideas for this video. End of attack means the effect activates at the end of that Digimon's attack and no other Digimon's attack. For example, BlackWarGreymon X can only unsuspend at the end of its attack outside of when it digivolves. On deletion effects, only need the top card of the Digimon stack to remain in trash for any inheritable effects to properly activate. BT8 Ofanimon Fall Down mode can play a BT9 Meikumon from its sources, and you would still gain the 2 memory for Meikumon's on deletion effect. When you're playing something out by an effect, the card will usually state whether it is played out by effect. BT13 Leopardmon's main effect says to play a green Digimon or a Royal Knight. When you do, reduce its play cost by 4. You are playing something by the main effect, so something like Crimson Blaze can actually stop this because it prevents playing by effect. Something like Digicross is not playing by effect. You are playing out a Digimon and the effect of Digicross interrupts to reduce the play cost of whatever you're playing. Digimon with no levels are not affected by level-based deletion or bounce effects. Death Xmon can't kill any D-Reapers as they have no level and are not affected by the delete all level 4 and lower Digimon from Death X. Likewise, something like EX4 Mach Galgamon cannot bounce Calumon as Calumon has no level. There are effects in older cards that change the name of the Digimon, like Promo Metal Greymon Alterous mode. While its name change to Metal Greymon applies to the deck, hand, trash, and board, this actually doesn't apply in the breeding area as it does not have the breeding tag, so you wouldn't be able to digivolve into something like Metal Greymon X Antibody over it since its name is not just Metal Greymon. More recent cards have been fixing this issue by having a rule box that changes its name, like BT15 Garomon. Digimon with effects are usually ready to be triggered as soon as they're on the board. Something like EX4 Gaussmon can actually see itself being played, triggering and activating its your turn effect. A more complex example of this is BT15 Gatomon digivolving from BT14 Patamon's start of main phase effect. Because the removal of Gatomon from security and the digivolve happen at the same time off Patamon's effect, Gatomon is able to see that a card was removed from security and triggers before Patamon's effect fully resolves. Once Patamon's effect is done, Gatomon activates and gains the memory. This is also why Patamon's inheritable effect triggers and activates after the start of main phase effect is done. Another topic that was brought up is security effects versus effects that do something when a security card is checked. If something like a hybrid with BT12 Takuya and sources check security, and the check card has a security effect, the security effect and Takuya's effect will trigger at the same time, but the security effect has priority and activates first before the effect of the Takuya inheritable. As long as the Digimon stays on field when the security effect resolves, Takuya's effect will then proceed to activate as normal. If the check card is a Digimon without a security effect, Takuya's effect will activate as normal regardless of if the Digimon dies in the ensuing battle or not. This is a similar scenario to something like BlackWarGreymon X Antibody, EX4 Shadow Seraphimon, or BT14 Koromon. Last topic that was brought up was Digimon that are unaffected. The big one for BT16 is going to be Magnamon X Antibody that cannot be affected by any of its opponent's effects when digivolving, and is able to refresh this protection when a card is removed from a security stack. These Digimon can still be targeted by effects, it's just that nothing will happen. So any effects like Final Shining Burst, for example, can still target Magnamon with the minus DP, it just won't kick in until Magnamon's protection wears off. Since Final Shining Burst is until the end of the opponent's turn, Magnamon would then receive the minus 12k once the turn passes over. A big counter to Magnamon X would be Venusmon. Magnamon X wouldn't get the minus 1 check when you digivolve, but as soon as turn passes over, Magnamon will receive the minus 1 check and then not be able to activate its when digivolving effect to refresh its protection due to Venusmon. Alright, I hope you're still with me because there's one more section that we've got to go through, and that's just general rulings that people have asked for a lot. Like the end of the effects section, I'm just going to rapid fire some topics that were given to me to explain. The battle area just consists of whatever's on your field. I bring this up because of the 4 Sovereigns deck. The level 5 Devas can play another Deva into the breeding area that doesn't have the same name as one in the battle area or the trash. The onplay doesn't count any Digimon cards that are in the sources of any of your level 6 or higher Digimon. Again, the game is getting a rules update in Japan that just refers to the battle area and breeding area collectively as just the area. The Floodgate rookies all stop different things that some people tend to mix up, but they're all pretty self-explanatory. The Digivolution cost Floodgates stop things like trainings or any effect that reduces the Digivolution cost, but does not stop any effect that causes the player to not pay the memory cost for Digivolution. These are BT5 Gaussmon, BT5 Syakomon, and BT5 Cutemon. The play cost floodgates stop stuff like Digicross or any effect that reduces the play cost, but like the Evo cost floodgates, does not stop anything that can be played without paying the memory cost. These are BT9 Slykomon, ST12 Solarmon, and ST13 Chikurimon. The effect floodgates stop Digimon from being played out by effects. Like I mentioned in the effects section, cards will read if they play something out by effect, and these rookies will stop them like Crimson Blaze would. These are BT9 Pillowmon, BT9 Pomumon, and BT14 Gotsumon. There's only one floodgate that stops players from ignoring Digivolution requirements, and that's BT8 Kokuomon. This one stops things like warp digivolving, like BT14 Agumon and BT15 Gabumon, or something like biomerging, which is from BT12 Takuya and ST17 Henry. Lastly, the memory floodgates stop your opponent from gaining memory with any effect except for Tamers, but does not stop you from losing memory. The keyword here is losing. To put this into an example, if you had a BlackWarGreymon X antibody and you delete your opponent's Digimon tagged with the effect of on deletion lose one memory, a memory floodgate on your opponent's field does not stop the memory loss. You are indirectly gaining memory because they are losing the memory. These floodgates are BT3 Terriermon, BT3 Chumon, BT3 Gazimon, and BT6 Madoki Betamon. The turn passes over when all pending effects have finished resolving. Let's say you pass the turn with Alphamon or Yukin mode on field. Alphamon's end of your turn effect triggers and activates, allowing you to bottom deck sources to gain 1 memory for each source. If you strip enough sources and bring the memory gauge back to 0, your turn continues. But if you don't, and memory is at 1 or more on your opponent's side, your turn ends and your opponent's begins. You can also skip parts of your opponent's turn and force them to go into their end phase. An example of this is your opponent being at 1 memory with you having Digimon Emperor aboard. If they decide to push out the level 3 that they have in raising, Digimon Emperor triggers and activates in breeding phase, and pushes memory to 1 on your side, and actually forces your opponent to go straight into their end phase, skipping their main phase. If you can somehow move the memory gauge back to your side when their turn begins, you can actually skip your opponent's turn entirely, bypassing their unsuspend, draw, breeding, and main phases entirely. This doesn't happen often, but can happen with stuff like EX2 Shuchong and BT11 Mirage Galgamon. And a card that says up to means that you must choose at least 1. What people might not know is that D-Digivolve is actually an up to X effect and is different from D-Digivolve 1. If you have a D-Digivolve of 2 or more, you can actually choose to only D-Digivolve 1. Let's take EX3 Chaosdramon as an example. Chaosdramon activates D-Digivolve 1 for each source put under it. This will trash 1 card at a time, unlike something like Ultimate Flare's D-Digivolve 3, which will actually simultaneously trash all 3 cards, if you choose to do all 3. A common ruling that people mix up is the top card versus the top Digivolution card. When an effect refers to the top card of the Digimon, it refers to the topmost card of your entire stack, like any of the Burst Mode cards or Omnimon Merciful Mode. If something refers to the top Digivolution card, it actually means the first card underneath the top card of the stack, like ST17 Magnamon. To continue off that note, a lot of people tend to mix up the term Digimon and Digimon card. When an effect refers to a Digimon, it's talking about the entire stack of cards that make up the Digimon. When an effect refers to a Digimon card, it's actually talking about any Digimon that's in your hand, trash, etc. For example, if you have an ace on the field that is D-Digivolved, the Digimon itself still exists on the field, but the card is now gone and overflows. Any on-play or your turn effects do not activate if the Digimon is instantly deleted. An example of this is if your opponent has Shine Greymon Ruin Mode's minus 5k DP effect active. If you were to push out something like Promo or BT16 Ukomon out of raising, Ukomon's your turn effect triggers, but rules processing will kick in and check the DP, sees Ukomon at 0, and deletes it before it can activate the your turn effect. When attacking and when an opponent's Digimon attacks is actually not the same timing. When attacking effects would trigger and activate first, and then when an opponent's Digimon attacks effects would trigger once those are done activating, as can be seen here. This is changed in Rules 4.0 in Japan to be the same timing like the area changes, but we don't know yet if we'll get the same rule change here in English. And finally, these last couple rulings deal with card text. In its traits, look for an exact match in traits, whereas in one of its traits, looks only for partial matches in traits. An example of this is BT10 Palmon and BT13 Lalamon searching for Ukomon. BT10 Palmon cannot grab Ukomon because it's an ancient fairy and not a fairy, but BT13 Lalamon can grab Ukomon because the word fairy is in Ukomon's traits. A big one that can get confusing is the number 1 versus the word 1. When you see a number 1 in card text, It means only a singular target for that effect, and you can't do any more than that. An example of this is if you play out 2 Digimon with Mervamon, you cannot use BT10 Taikuya's effect to use Tame Resources to Digicross, since you are playing out 2 Digimon, even if one of those Digimon does not have Digicross. When you see the word 1 in card text, it means one or more things that meet those conditions. LM1 Bokomon can actually save a board of Gamamons from a board wipe, because when one of them would leave the field, you can delete Bokomon to prevent it being all Digimon with Gamamon in text, from leaving. And lastly, what X in its text actually means. Whenever you see a card refer to X in its text, it is always referring to the topmost card of the stack. The text can be printed anywhere on the card, but it must be the top card only. Inheritable effects of any cards underneath the top card do not count towards this. And no, material save does not count towards save in text because it's a different keyword. The main decks that do have stuff like this are currently Hunters and Gamamon. Hey guys, Editor Jorel here the day after recording, just to toss in one last idea that somebody gave me to put in the general ruling section, and that's how your security stack is placed. Now, I've actually seen people get this wrong a lot, and that's after drawing their 5 cards, they literally take the top 5 cards of their deck, and then they'll just place it down in security just like that. That's actually incorrect. The rulebook literally says how to place down your security, and that's the top card of your deck. After drawing your 5 cards should be the bottom card of your security stack. So this is the correct way how it should be placed. Again, I've seen people get this wrong a lot, but just know that if you're playing in anything higher than your locals, that some people may literally call you out on this for putting down your security in the wrong order. Alright, that was a lot of me talking and possibly a massive amount of info that was thrown into your face at once. In any case, I hope you did end up learning something from this, and if you have any questions, please by all means ask me in the comments or ask me in our Discord. We even have a rulings questions channel. Also, I want to give a massive thank you to the judges in the Bandai Organized Play Discord who helped give me ideas and examples for this video, and like I said at the start, this video wouldn't be a thing without the initial discussion with them. Please do check them out if you want to ask or brush up on any rulings questions. They are a great resource, and sometimes I even get my rulings from them. Link is in the description below. And one last thing is thanks to all my friends that also gave a few of the ideas here and there. Thanks for watching if you've made it this far, and I hope to see you in the next video.